Something feels off about this draft, and if you've been paying close attention, you've probably noticed it too. Big names are still sitting on the board longer than expected. Teams are passing on players they were heavily linked to just weeks ago, and instead of predictable, safe decisions, we are seeing moves that don't quite add up at first glance. Especially when teams like the Cleveland Browns step in and completely flip expectations at a critical pick. Because here's the thing, this isn't just random. When multiple franchises start making questionable decisions at the same time, it usually means one thing: there's something happening behind the scenes that fans aren't fully seeing yet. Take the quarterback situation. Players like Ty Simpson are being talked about in ways that don't match the public rankings. Meanwhile, rumors suggest other names might be quietly rising on draft boards. And when that kind of disconnect shows up, it raises a serious question. Are teams playing the long game while everyone else is focused on the obvious? At the same time, contenders are making moves that feel unusually cautious. Instead of chasing game-changing talent, some teams look like they're trying not to mess up. And that shift, from aggressive to careful, might be the biggest clue of all. Even franchises like the Dallas Cowboys and Pittsburgh Steelers are showing signs of thinking beyond just this season. There's a growing sense that certain organizations are quietly preparing for major transitions, especially at the quarterback position. And once you start connecting all these dots, the draft stops looking random and starts looking strategic. But that's where things get even more interesting. Because one decision near the top didn't just surprise people, it set off a chain reaction that could reshape the entire first round. And then everything shifted. When the Cleveland Browns got on the clock at number 6, most people thought they already knew what was coming. The board still had elite defensive talent sitting there. There were edge rushers slipping. There were players ranked higher across almost every mock draft. On paper, this should have been one of the easiest picks of the night. But instead, they went in a completely different direction. They took Cardell Tate. And instantly, the reaction was mixed. Some people loved it. Others were confused. Because this wasn't just a best player available move, this felt intentional. This felt like a team making a statement about what they believe their future needs to look like. The moment you look deeper, it starts to make more sense. This pick isn't just about adding a wide receiver, it's about committing to building around a quarterback. And more specifically, it's about making life easier for Cam Ward. Because whether people want to admit it or not, when a team invests in a quarterback or plans to, they start stacking the offense differently. They stop thinking about value and start thinking about support. And Tate fits that idea perfectly. He may not have the flashiest numbers, he may not have the fastest 40 time. In fact, there were even whispers that his speed could be a concern. But when you actually watch him play, none of that seems to matter. He creates separation, he finds space. And somehow, he's always just out of reach of defenders. That's the kind of player quarterbacks trust. And that's the kind of player this pick was really about. Still, it doesn't erase the bigger question. Why pass on premium defensive talent? Because let's be real, guys who were projected near the top were still sitting there. Players that could have changed the identity of that defense immediately. And yet, the Browns chose offense. They chose rhythm. They chose chemistry over raw upside on the other side of the ball. That tells you everything about their mindset. They're not trying to build a balanced team right now. They're trying to build an explosive one. But here, where it gets interesting. This decision didn't just affect Cleveland. It forced every team behind them to rethink their strategy. Suddenly, players expected to go earlier started sliding even further. Teams that were planning one move had to adjust on the fly. And just like that, one pick turned into a domino effect. Because what happened next only made things more unpredictable. But here, where things start to feel off. Because while everyone was focused on the flashy picks and quarterback talk, something way more unusual was happening quietly in the background. Elite defensive talent, guys who were projected to go near the top, were still sitting there, waiting. And not just one or two names. Multiple. Players like David Bailey, who some reports claim was one of the most explosive edge rushers in the entire class, were still on the board deep into the top 10. And that's not normal. In most drafts, pass rushers like that don't last. Teams reach for them, they trade up for them, they don't just slide. So what changed? That's the question nobody seems to have a clear answer for. Some analysts have pointed to small concerns, things like lack of bend or questions about technique. Others have mentioned physical traits, arm length, consistency, or scheme fit. But here's the thing, those kinds of concerns have always existed, and they've never stopped teams from taking a chance on elite upside before. Which is why this feels different. There's been quiet speculation, nothing confirmed, just talk, that teams might be seeing something deeper during private evaluations. Maybe it's interviews, maybe it's medicals, maybe it's just how certain players fit into very specific systems. But whatever it is, it's clearly affecting how front offices are thinking. And when multiple teams start passing on the same high-level talent, that's when it stops being coincidence. It becomes a pattern. What makes it even more interesting is how it shifts the entire draft dynamic. Because now, teams that didn't expect these players to be available suddenly have options they weren't prepared for, and that creates hesitation. Do you stick to your plan, or do you grab the unexpected value? That split-second decision can change everything. And you could actually feel that tension building as the picks continued. Teams weren't just selecting players, they were reacting to a board that wasn't unfolding the way anyone predicted. Which brings up a bigger question. Are these players actually falling because of real concerns, or are teams overthinking it? Because we've seen this before. Talented prospects drop for reasons that don't fully make sense in the moment, and then later, they turn into stars while everyone wonders how they slipped. And if that's what's happening here, then someone is about to get a steal. But eventually, someone had to make the move. And when that finally happened, it didn't just stop the slide, it completely shifted the direction of the draft. And just when it felt like teams were hesitating, one franchise finally made a move that changed everything. The New Orleans Saints stepped up, and instead of playing it safe, they went straight for impact. They took David Bailey. Now on the surface, that sounds like a simple best player available pick, but in the context of how this draft was unfolding, it was much bigger than that. Because this was the moment where a team finally said, "We're not overthinking this." While others passed, the Saints pulled the trigger. And that decision instantly flipped the energy of the board. Coming into this pick, there was a real argument that New Orleans should focus on helping their offense. There's been ongoing conversation about needing more weapons, more support, more stability, especially with a young quarterback situation that still feels like it's evolving. In that scenario, going wide receiver or even offensive line would have made perfect sense. But they didn't do that. They chose defense. They chose pressure. They chose disruption. And more importantly, they chose upside over immediate need. Because Bailey isn't just another defensive piece, he's the type of player that can change how offenses operate. Explosive, aggressive, constantly attacking, he brings something that can't easily be coached. And when you have a chance to grab that kind of talent, sometimes you just don't pass it up. Still, not everyone agrees with it. There's been quiet debate around this type of move. Some believe it's the right call, stack elite talent and figure the rest out later. Others think it's risky, that ignoring offensive needs could slow down development on the other side of the ball. And that's where things get interesting. Because this pick represents a bigger divide in how teams are approaching this draft. Some are building around quarterbacks, others are building identity through defense. And right now, those two philosophies are colliding in real time. But here's the part that really matters. The Saints didn't just add a player, they broke the pattern. Up until that moment, teams were hesitating, overanalyzing, letting talent slide. But with one decision, New Orleans reset the board and forced everyone else to react. Now suddenly, teams behind them had no more excuses. The falling star narrative over. The waiting game done. And just like that, the pressure shifted to the next franchises on the clock. Because now, every pick wasn't just about value anymore. It was about not being the team that overthought it and got left behind. And then came a pick that didn't shock anyone, but still managed to raise a lot of questions. When the Cincinnati Bengals stepped up, the expectation wasn't chaos. It wasn't some wild reach or surprise move. If anything, people were expecting something clean, logical, and safe. And that's exactly what they did. They went with a cornerback, Mansour Delane, solid player, good tape, reliable, the kind of prospect that checks boxes without raising too many concerns. On paper, it makes sense. The Bengals needed help in the secondary, and this fills that gap immediately. But here's the problem. It also felt like a missed opportunity. Because sitting on the board at that moment were still players with much higher ceilings. Impact players, game changers, the kind of talent that can shift momentum, not just plug holes. And instead of taking that swing, Cincinnati chose stability. And that tells you a lot about where this team's mindset is right now. This isn't a team drafting to rebuild. This is a team trying to stay competitive, trying to avoid mistakes, trying to keep the floor high instead of pushing the ceiling higher. But in today's league, is that enough? There's been a growing conversation. Some analysts have hinted at it. Some fans are starting to question it, that teams like the Bengals might be playing it a little too safe in critical moments. Not because they don't recognize talent, but because they're prioritizing certainty over upside. And that approach can be dangerous. Because while a safe pick rarely hurts you, it also rarely changes anything. It doesn't create fear in opponents. It doesn't shift the balance of power. It just keeps things steady. And when other teams around you are taking risks, adding explosive players, and chasing greatness, staying steady can quietly turn into falling behind. Now, to be fair, there's another side to this. You could argue this is exactly what Cincinnati needed: a dependable corner, a player who can come in, start early, and contribute right away. No questions, no waiting, no development curve, just production. And maybe that's the plan. But in a draft that's already been unpredictable, where players are sliding and opportunities are opening up, passing on higher upside talent feels like a decision that could be looked back on later. Especially if one of those falling stars turns into something special. Because then the conversation changes. Then it's not about making a smart pick. It's about playing it too safe when the moment called for something bigger. And right after this pick, that contrast became even clearer. And then came a pick that felt like it was pulled straight out of a different era. When the Dallas Cowboys made their move, they didn't chase hype. They didn't go for flash. They didn't try to win the headlines. They went old school. C.J. Allen, a linebacker who does wow you with speed or highlight plays, but shows up every single snap. Physical, gritty, the kind of player that lives between the tackles and doesn't shy away from contact. The type coaches love, but fans are split on. Because in today's NFL, that kind of pick feels risky in a different way. Not because the player is bad, but because the league has changed. Modern defenses are built on speed, versatility, and coverage. Linebackers are expected to run sideline to sideline, cover tight ends, drop into space, and still stop the run. And while Allen brings toughness, there are real questions about whether that classic linebacker mold still holds the same value it used to. And that's exactly where the divide comes in. Some fans see this as a smart, foundational pick, a guy who can anchor the defense, fill gaps, and bring a level of physicality that's been missing. The kind of player who might not go viral, but wins games quietly. Others, they see it completely differently. They see a team passing on more dynamic talent, players with higher ceilings, athletes who better match where the game is heading. And to them, this feels like Dallas playing it safe, or worse, playing it outdated. But here what makes it even more interesting. The Cowboys didn't stop there. Later, they doubled down on that same philosophy with Kendrick Falk, a versatile defensive lineman who can move around, plug gaps, and bring physical presence across the front. Another high-motor, high-effort player. Another no-nonsense type of pick. And when you look at both moves together, a clear pattern starts to form. This isn't accidental. This is identity. Dallas is trying to rebuild toughness, re-establish control at the line of scrimmage. They're not chasing trends, they're trying to impose their own style, and whether that works or not depends on one thing. Can old-school football still dominate in a modern game? Because if it works, these picks will look like a masterclass in team building. But if it doesn't, people are going to look back and wonder why they passed on speed, explosiveness, and upside when it mattered most. And right after this, the conversation around the draft shifted again. Because suddenly, it wasn't just about talent anymore. It was about philosophy. But while teams were arguing over defense, playmakers, and safe picks, there was a completely different conversation brewing underneath everything. Quarterbacks. And not just who's going first, but who teams are quietly targeting. Because the more this draft unfolds, the clearer it becomes. The public rankings might not match what teams are actually thinking, and that's where things get messy. Take Ty Simpson, for example. Depending on who you ask, he's either a late first-round guy or someone teams are seriously considering much earlier than expected. And that gap between perception and reality, that's where the drama lives. Because rumors suggest, nothing confirmed, but there's been a lot of buzz that some front offices see Simpson as a much safer long-term option than people realize. Not flashy, not overwhelming, but steady, coachable, a system fit. And in today's NFL, that matters more than ever. But then you've got names like Garrett Nussmeier floating around the conversation too. Reports claim he's been gaining traction behind the scenes, especially with teams that value experience in pro-style systems. Some even believe he could sneak into the first round if the right team gets aggressive. Again, nothing official. But the noise is getting louder. And when that happens, it usually means something is shifting. Because we've seen this story before, quarterbacks rise late, teams fall in love with traits that don't show up on highlight reels, and suddenly, a player nobody expected goes earlier than anyone predicted. At the same time, there's another layer to this. Some teams might not even be drafting quarterbacks for this year. They're thinking ahead. Franchises with aging starters or uncertain futures are starting to look at this class differently, not as immediate saviors, but as long-term investments. Sit them, develop them, and hope they're ready when the time comes. And that changes everything. Because now, it's not just about talent, it's about timing. Which team pulls the trigger early, which team waits too long, and which team ends up reaching because they're afraid of missing out. That pressure builds fast. And once one team makes a move, the entire board can shift in seconds. But here's the most interesting part. Not everyone is convinced this quarterback class is elite. In fact, some believe it's being overhyped, that a few of these names are climbing simply because teams need quarterbacks, not because they're truly top-tier prospects. And if that's true, then someone is going to take a risk that could define their franchise for years. Because in the NFL, nothing changes a team faster than a quarterback decision. For better or worse. And what happens next might prove exactly which teams got it right. But while everyone was focused on the chaos happening on the surface, one team might have been playing a completely different game. The Pittsburgh Steelers. Because unlike some of the other franchises in this draft, Pittsburgh doesn't usually panic. They don't chase headlines. They don't overreact. If anything, they're known for doing the opposite, moving quietly while everyone else is distracted. And right now, there's a growing feeling that they're setting something up. It starts with the quarterback situation. On paper, bringing in Aaron Rodgers might look like a short-term solution, a veteran presence, a way to stay competitive right now. But let's be honest, nobody believes that's a long-term answer. And the Steelers know that. Which is why this draft feels like a perfect opportunity for them to think ahead. Not for this season, but for what comes next. There's been quiet speculation, nothing confirmed, but it's been talked about that Pittsburgh could be targeting a quarterback earlier than expected. Not necessarily to start immediately, but to develop, to sit behind a veteran, to learn the system before being thrown into the spotlight. And if you look at how successful teams operate, that strategy makes a lot of sense. Because here's the reality. The Steelers are rarely bad enough to draft at the very top. They don't tank, they don't collapse. They stay competitive almost every year. But that consistency creates a problem. It makes it harder to land elite quarterback talent naturally. So what do? You get ahead of it. You draft your guy before you desperately need him. And that's where names like Ty Simpson start to make things interesting. He might not be the most hyped player in this class. He might not go top 5, but he fits the profile of someone a team like Pittsburgh could believe in. Smart, steady, moldable. The kind of quarterback you can build over time instead of rushing into action. But again, this is all speculation. No one knows for sure what the Steelers are planning. And that's exactly what makes it dangerous. Because if they are targeting a quarterback, they're not going to announce it, they're not going to tip their hand, they'll wait, they'll watch, and when the moment is right, they'll move. And when they do, it could catch everyone off guard. Because in a draft filled with loud decisions and obvious strategies, the quiet moves are usually the ones that matter most. And if Pittsburgh pulls this off, they might be setting themselves up for the next decade without anyone even realizing it in the moment. And then, the pattern became impossible to ignore. After all the chaos, the debates, the surprising picks, teams suddenly started moving in the same direction. Not defense, not risky upside swings. Offense. More specifically, protection and weapons. Because once a few key picks came off the board, franchises shifted their mindset almost instantly. It wasn't about finding the best overall player anymore, it was about building around quarterbacks. And when that switch flips, everything speeds up. Wide receivers started coming off faster. Tight ends with size and athleticism became priority targets. Offensive linemen, especially versatile ones, suddenly looked more valuable than ever. It wasn't random. It was intentional. Teams are starting to realize something very simple. If your quarterback isn't comfortable, nothing else matters. And you could see that philosophy play out in real time. Franchises with young quarterbacks, or even uncertain ones, weren't taking chances anymore. They weren't waiting for later rounds. They were aggressively stacking support early, more weapons, better protection, fewer excuses. Because in today's NFL, development is everything. A quarterback doesn't just need talent, he needs time, he needs space, he needs reliable targets, and if you don't give him that early, you risk slowing everything down. That's why this run felt different. It wasn't about flashy picks, it was about survival. You saw teams prioritize offensive linemen who could play multiple positions, guards who could shift to tackle, tackles who could hold up in both run and pass protection. That flexibility, it's becoming more valuable than pure specialization. At the same time, the skill positions followed right behind. Big-bodied receivers, athletic tight ends, players who can create mismatches and make life easier for quarterbacks in tough situations, not just deep threats, but reliable options. And when you step back, it all connects. This is the ripple effect of earlier decisions. When teams like the Cleveland Browns commit to supporting a quarterback early, others take notice. When offensive help starts coming off the board, nobody wants to be left behind. Because the last thing any franchise wants is to invest in a quarterback and then fail to protect him. We've seen how that story ends. So now, instead of waiting, teams are acting early. They're building the infrastructure first and trusting that everything else will follow. But here, where it gets interesting. When everyone starts thinking the same way, value shifts again. And that raises a new question. If every team is focused on offense, who's taking advantage of what's being left behind? And when you step back and look at everything that just happened, it stops looking like a normal draft. It starts looking like a shift. Because this wasn't just about who got picked where, it wasn't just about surprise selections or players falling. There's a bigger pattern underneath all of it, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Teams are thinking differently now. Some franchises, like the Cleveland Browns, are clearly prioritizing offense and quarterback support above everything else. They're not waiting, they're not balancing, they're going all in on making life easier for their signal caller. Others, like the Dallas Cowboys, are going in the opposite direction, leaning into physicality, toughness, and control. They're not chasing trends, they're trying to impose a style. And then you've got teams like the Pittsburgh Steelers, who might be playing a completely different game altogether. Quiet, calculated, possibly planning moves that won't make sense now, but could define their future later. That's three completely different philosophies happening at the same time. And that's why this draft feels unpredictable. Because there's no clear, right way anymore. Some teams are chasing upside, others are avoiding risk. Some are building for today, others are quietly building for 3 years from now. And when all those approaches collide in one draft, you get chaos. But you also get opportunity. Because every time a team plays it safe, another team has a chance to take a risk. Every time a player falls, someone else gets value. And every time a franchise overthinks a decision, another one might walk away with a future star. That's what makes this so interesting. Because years from now, we're not going to remember where players were projected. We are going to remember who got it right, who trusted their instincts, who didn't panic, and who saw something others didn't. Because in the end, drafts like this don't just reveal players. They reveal teams. And the truth is, some of these decisions are going to age incredibly well. And some of them are going to come back and haunt franchises for years.